Do you actually need an emergency fund? Well, in this video, I'm going to go through a few things that you can evaluate for yourself so you can know whether your situation warrants actually having an emergency fund or just forgetting it altogether. Hey, I'm Evan. I'm a certified financial planner, and every day I help Canadians just like you invest smarter, reduce their tax bill, and make good decisions about emergency funds. So, do you actually need one? Well, let me ask you a few questions and maybe you can decide for yourself. Have you ever known anybody that's gotten into a car accident before, had a pet that needed surgery, had an unexpected home expense, like their dishwasher went out, their fridge stopped working, the roof is leaking, flood in the basement, something like that? What did that cost? If you hadn't had any of those things yourself, consider yourself lucky and consider planning for that today. If you have had one of those things happen to you before, how did you pay for it? Did you use a credit card? Did you borrow money from your long-term savings? Did you borrow from friends or family? Or did you use something even more expensive like a payday loan service that would cost you crazy amounts of interest even over a very short period of time? Wouldn't it be nice to just have that money on hand so you could just pay it off and move on with your life? Well, in 2022, there was a survey done by Stats Canada, and they found that 26% of households did not have enough money on hand to come up with $500 of an unexpected expense. All of those things that I mentioned before, unexpected home repair, health expense, loss of a job, didn't even talk about that one, but those would cost way more than $500 in most cases. And so many of you watching, or at least you know somebody who wouldn't be able to come up with this kind of money on their own. This is where an emergency fund comes in and can help you get through the short term. Everybody wants to talk about the long term and investing and growth and making all this money and retiring and financial independence, but none of those things matter. None of them matter if you can't get through the short term. And an emergency fund is all about weathering the things that are always going to happen to you, no matter your circumstance, and they'll allow you to have cash on hand to be able to pay for them and continue thinking about those things that are more long-term focused and more interesting and more beneficial for you down the road. So I didn't outright say it, but I think that most people should have an emergency fund. So if you do need an emergency fund, how much do you actually need? Simple answer, start with something. The $500 that 26% of Canadians cannot come up with on their own would be a great place to start. Or things are a little bit tight, aim for that. But if things are a little bit tight, then at least you have that $500 set aside for some of those smaller expenses that might come up, and then over time you can build up to something more. Eventually you want to aim for having a few months of expenses set aside. I'm going to say expenses, not necessarily just income, because income allows you to do other things like spending on things that are fun and interesting and going on vacations and going out for meals and things like that. If you're worried about an emergency where you're running out of money from not having employment, or there's a major expense where you need to come up with a lot of money right away, covering off your expenses is the most critical thing. So that would be things like mortgage or rent, utilities, your phone bill. These are the things you can't live without. Groceries, the minimum payments on your debt, all of these kind of things. So you can calculate that for yourself and figure out what a few months of expenses would be and set that aside in cash. Again, this isn't going to happen overnight. This is going to be something that takes some time, but that's okay. You need to start somewhere and build up to that amount over time. If you're someone who has variable income or you're in a single income household, you might consider having more than that just because the risks on your income are much higher. And so you want to be even more prepared when things might go wrong. Okay, so how do you actually get started in building one of these things up? I'd recommend that you set up an emergency fund as a savings account at a different bank than what you use for your day-to-day spending and your income and all that kind of stuff, so that it's set aside entirely, so it's out of sight, out of mind. You're not even thinking about spending it if you see a balance there. So if you bank with Bank A, have a savings account over at Bank B, and every month or every time you get paid, maybe that's twice a month or whatever, set up an automatic transfer from your Bank A over to Bank B. And so it happens automatically, so you don't have to think about it, you don't have to have the discipline, it just happens and it takes care of itself over time. Now, what do you do if there's actually an emergency? Well, that's a good question, and that's kind of the whole point here. And so I recommend that you set up a list of things that are specific to you and your own financial situation that you would deem to be an emergency. If you don't do this, it's very easy to turn a home renovation into an emergency, a vacation into an emergency, a new fancy car, whatever. These things aren't emergencies. They're fun, nice things to have, and it's good to save for them separately from an emergency fund. But this is your money that you've set aside to make sure that you can get through the worst parts of your financial life if the worst should happen. And it's so easy to think that it'll never happen to you during the times that are really good, but those are the times that you need to particularly plan for the worst. So once you've built your list of things that you've deemed to be an emergency that would qualify for an emergency, if you've had one of these things, then you can set up a transfer from Bank B back over to your regular checking account, pay off your credit card or whatever that you use to pay off the emergency, or just wait the few days. It's always going to take a few days to actually transfer between banks. That's normal. But once that's all done, then you can restart the process of rebuilding your emergency fund from before. If you need to wait until you have income again, if you lost your job or something like that, that's fine. But eventually the process needs to restart and you need to have that emergency fund built up again before you can worry about long-term savings or things like that. Some people often say, well, why wouldn't I just have a line of credit instead? A line of credit is just something where you can borrow money and then pay it back over time. Usually every month there's an interest-only payment that comes along with that. And so the interest-only payments can be a lot easier to manage than having to pay down principal every month. The interest rate is going to be lower than a credit card and whatever. So it's really flexible. It's easy to access. It doesn't cost you anything if you don't use it. Lots of great things about lines of credit for sure. But one reason why I wouldn't recommend you use this as your only form of emergency backup is that when you borrow, even if the interest is low, even if it's flexible, there's still a cost associated with it. And you only use an emergency fund if it's an emergency. So you're dealing with an emergency that now has an additional cost on it. So even though the emergency, the initial one is covered, now we still have the same amount of money over here that's growing. And it's a growing problem because of the interest cost along with it. Yeah, it's fine, I think, but for the right person only. If you're a high income person, that would probably be a good idea. If you don't have any other debt that's on a variable interest rate, that's another reason to not consider a line of credit. When interest rates rise, the cost of interest on a line of credit also goes up, and so there could be a bad timing problem there where debt isn't necessarily as cheap as it once was. So an emergency in this case could go from an immediate problem to a long-term one if you're not able to get ahead of the debt in the first place. So I'm okay with people having a line of credit and using that as part of their emergency strategy. Having some cash is always going to be a good idea. Maybe do 50-50 or something like that, but having cash set aside is usually the best option. Now, on the other side of things, there are other considerations as well. The main one is that it is an opportunity cost. And an opportunity cost is not a real, like, money out of pocket cost. It's something that implies that you could be doing something else with that money instead. And that opportunity could be the fun things that I mentioned before, but it could also be things like long-term investing and investing in the stock market. So when you put money into a savings account for an emergency fund, the rate of return that you get on that is probably going to be almost nothing, maybe a few percent if you're lucky. But that's not the point of an emergency fund. You want the money to be available and ready. It's not going to be there to grow. Whereas you might see your long-term investments growing every year along with the stock market. That doesn't always happen either. There are going to be times where it declines in value, which is the value of the cash set aside your emergency fund. But over a long enough period of time, you might say, man, I haven't had too many of these emergencies and my stock portfolio is doing really, really well. Shoot, that's too bad, right? Because that's an opportunity cost that really exists when you have cash set aside. So instead of saying it's an all or nothing opportunity cost, I would say use this idea to determine how much would be appropriate for you. If you're someone that has an average income, $100,000 households before tax, $60,000 after tax, whatever the case is, in that realm, if you have a couple $1,000 set aside, is that going to be too much? Is that too much of an opportunity cost? No, it's not, because that's not going to make a meaningful difference over the long term if you just have that money set aside, especially if you have capacity to save for the long term in addition to that. But if you have $100,000 of income and you have $100,000 set aside in an emergency fund, yeah, that's objectively too much, and it wouldn't necessarily make sense for you to have that as an emergency. That's a whole year's worth of income, and you're very unlikely to need that much cash set aside, not necessarily earning anything for the long term. So there's a bit of a trade-off here between actual cost and opportunity cost that you want to consider, risk, reward, that whole trade-off. The other consideration here is that many people's emergencies, financially speaking, come from the inability to work, and this is where disability insurance can come into play. Many people have disability insurance through their workplace benefits program, but if you're self-employed, you need to have disability insurance, because that is one of the major things that could come up for someone who relies on themselves for their income, is that if you're no longer able to do your job, you don't have an income. You could fall off a ladder, twist your ankle, something like that. If you have a physical job, you could have a bad back or carpal tunnel, something like that. You might not even be able to sit at a computer. You could lose your eyesight. I've seen all sorts of different things like this. So having disability insurance is something that can step in addition to your emergency fund, especially for the long term. I'm not going to go into all the details of disability insurance, but that is part of your contingent strategy for any of these major things that could happen in your financial life. Those are my thoughts on emergency funds. Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested in content like this, I have a podcast called The Canadian Money Roadmap, and you can find it here on YouTube, but also on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to audio podcasts. Glad to have you there. I've got a new episode every week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.